Hey guys, welcome back to my channel, and today we have a new video. What if Ace came back to life part 2? Before we get started, please hit that like and subscribe button. Disclaimer. One Piece is owned by Eiichiro Oda. I do not own anything One Piece related. Obviously. Let's get started. Chapter 9. Ace's Devil Fruit? Luffy stood there, his eyes widening as he stared at the man in front of him, speechless. His mind started to carry him away, ignoring He-Man, who began to explain how devil fruit users' fruits live on after their death, regrowing in different places. After Ace's death in utmost secret, the master got hold of the regrown Mera fruit. Laughing, the man proclaimed to the straw-hatted boy, unable to sense the tension in the air. To think he'd use a Logia fruit as a prize for his business. Laughing yet again, the man slapped his knees. I just don't get him. If I had an amazing fruit like that one, I could easily change my life around. The unusually quiet captain raised his head, his pupils clearing. Slamming his foot into the ground as he held his fists up to the man, fury shrouded his eyes. Like I would let you eat it. Taken back by his sudden proclamation, Frankie raised an eyebrow, before his eyes slightly widened. Ah! He shook his head, now understanding why his captain had been silent the whole time. That's right. How could I forget? Ace is your. Before he had time to finish what he was saying, Luffy grabbed the man by his collar, his pupils still shaking as he screamed in the man's face. I want it. The Mera fruit. Silence shook the small street, as both the man and Frankie stared at the teen in surprise. Oh oi. Luffy bro. You know that you dash. Luffy quickly interrupted Frankie again, stating the question that the cyborg was about to ask. I've already got my Gomu fruit, so I can't eat it. The straw-hatted boy looked back down onto the ground, his fists clenched and shading to the color black. But, I don't want Ace's ability to be taken by just anyone. His eyes started to swell up as memories clouded his flooded eyes, recalling their meeting in Alabasta. Back then, even Luffy could tell how proud Ace was when he got his devil fruit, knowing well that his brother had told him countless times in the past how much he would love to find a devil fruit for himself. And now, someone was daring to take away something his brother held precious to him. Something that only Ace should have had. I'm going to win it. The man in front of him winced at his words, fright trembling through him as he tried to escape the boy's grip. What? Looking the man in the eye, Luffy clenched his fist, his eyes filling with determination. I'm going to win Ace's devil fruit. There's no way that I'm going to let anyone else is going to have it. Laughing bellowed at the side of Luffy, as the cyborg nodded in agreement, obviously overjoyed by his captain's statement. You're crazy. You shouldn't underestimate our master. The man stuttered back, though his words simply bounced off the rubber captain's ears. Frankie crossed his arms over his chest, a chuckle passing from his lips. I hate to break it, but the term crazy is something which is associated with our captain a lot. Doesn't seem to bother him or us at all. With his eyes shadowed, Luffy continued to stare into the man's eyes. Lifting the glasses he once had on against his face, Luffy turned to his companion, a calmer look washing down his eyes as he gave Frankie a light smile. Frankie, do you want it? Frankie stared at his captain, a slight hint of surprise and gratitude hidden in his eyes by his glasses. Mirroring his captain's smile before turning it into a full-teethed grin, he laughed. Nah, I'm good thanks. I'd rather be able to swim. Looking at the tint of disappointment in Luffy's eyes, he raised his fist. Though let me tell you this. Whatever you do, don't let this chance get away. Lowering his fist, he was glad to see his captain's attention fully on what the cyborg had just said, as he stood firmly, giving another little chuckle. Besides, if you don't do this now, then you'll regret it later. After all, we have business at the Colosseum anyway. Nodding at his own proposal, He leaned in a little closer to Luffy. "If we don't do this, it'll just make things boring." Slowly lifting his face, Luffy threw Frankie a huge grin, fist pumping the sky. "You're right." Turning to face the narrow end of the street, the teen nodded at Frankie before they started to run, Luffy's fist still in the air. "Yosh! Let's do this." Letting his fist fall to the ground, his eyes started to glaze, a sad smile on his lips. "Don't worry, Ace. I'll win this for you. We're finally here. That took forever." "Oh?" Ace turned to face the voice, smirking. "You didn't enjoy your first journey on a pirate ship?" Twitching, the voice turned away, scowling. "Shut up." Looking away from the freckled man, its eyes suddenly widened at the sight of the suspicious wooden objects walking around the harbor. "What is that?" Looking at the direction of the voice's gaze, Ace lifted his eyebrow. Are those toys?" he questioned with a mixture of disbelief and amusement in his voice. Before the voice had time to answer, Ace was toppled over by a hurrying flash of brown, green and white. The flash, no person quickly apologized, running off into the midst of the town center, disappearing from their sights. Looking down at the fallen commander, the voice laughed, looking at the bewildered expression written on Ace's face. "And no way. That couldn't have been." The commander stayed silent, lost in his thoughts, not even choosing to glance up at the laughing figure. This caused the said figure to raise an eyebrow and properly examine the fire thrower's expression. He looked startled, like he himself had seen a ghost as he slowly raised himself of the ground, still silent. "What's wrong?" Jumping from the question, he blinked, turning to face the voice. Nothing." The silent whisper came from his lips as he raised his hand to shake his head, sighing. "Just losing it. Nothing too out of the ordinary." He chuckled, sending the voice yet another smirk as his attention was caught by the toys again. Deciding not to comment on that declaration, the voice drew its attention to the toys as well, tilting its head a little as it stuttered, trying to find the right words to ask. "How are they walking around like that?" "Believe it or not, I was just about to ask you the same thing," Ace replied, nodding. His eyes suddenly sparked up with recognition, turning to face the voice with his finger pointed up. "I've got it." "Really?" Placing his fist in his hand, he replied with his head back, laughing. "It's a mystery." Sighing, the voice decided to ignore the childish fire thrower, starting to walk forward before its eyes halted on a certain object on the ground. "It looks like that person dropped something when they banged into you." Silencing his laugh, Ace walked past the voice as his eyes too fell in the object waving on the ground, his fingers gripping onto the damp edges of the pages. Staring at the bold headline, his eyes widened, his face totally and utterly blank. "Prize for tournament revealed, legendary Mara Mara Nomi fruit." Haruta tried her best to hold on to the tears which were longing to fall from her eyes, her body shaking, as she watched her captain run off the ship, into the town. 1,000 different feelings wound up inside of her chest, her breathing becoming short and her eyes stinging. She'd stupidly led herself to believe that ever since they'd left that island, that Ace was somehow alive. But that one little hope was now shattered. She was wrong. So wrong about everything. About Ace's grave. He hadn't come back. He hadn't mysteriously blasted himself from inside the grave. He wasn't alive. Giving up on the tremendous force coming from her eyes, she started to sob, leaning back on the rail as he lifted her hand to hide her eyes, the tears smothering down their cheeks and onto the ground. Letting out a high-pitched wail, she continued to cry, her grip hardening even more on the newspaper. She suddenly felt her feet moving, running as she jumped off the ship despite the shouts from behind her, down the streets of the highly decorated harbor. The tears started to drift behind her, causing her sight to blur. Before she knew it, she tumbled sharply into a figure dressed in a cloak. losing grip on the newspaper in her hand. Sorry. Holding up a hand in apology, she continued running, deciding not to glance at the stranger she had previously crashed into as her steps became lighter and slower. Breathing harshly, she griped the center of her blouse, her pupils shaking and her face sodden. Taking one deep breath, she lifted her face up to take in her surroundings, ignoring the toys which were unusually walking and talking around, as her thoughts caught up to her. Where was she now? She hadn't exactly thought up a destination back when she departed from the did more of a blind running stumbling into people kind of destination, and now she was lost. And it must have showed, as someone gripped her shoulder from behind. Instantly freeing her from her thoughts and causing her instincts to flare up, she turned around, her eyes narrowing. The stranger immediately putting his hands up in defense in front of his face, he laughed, stepping back. Hey. Don't give me that look. Look. He slowly lowered his hands down, causing Haruta to become more calmer, her gaze softening a bit. Just a little. What do you want? She glared at the man, trying to intimidate him. Though due to the tears running down her cheek and snot which was peeking out of her nose, she probably looked more like a harmless lost child than a brute fighter. Giving the girl a smile, the man chuckled. You were just standing there in the middle of the court looking startled and scared. Figured someone should check if you're all right. He turned to look back at the shaking girl, his face coming into the sunlight. Only then did Haruta realize the painful penetrating scar which smothered part of the stranger's face, causing her pupils to widen slightly. She slowly pointed to it, ignoring all comments which would tell her it is rude to ask, curiosity glazed in her eyes. Huh? Lowering his hand, his eyes widened, his face clearly showing he was not expecting such a blunt reaction. Surprise gone, he simply smiled politely again, bringing his finger over his lips in a hushed voice. This? It's a secret. Raising her eyebrows, she sighed, giving him a bored and expressionless look. Well, that's boring. She huffed, stretching her arms out above her head. Finding her statement funny, the stranger laughed, leaning in closer to the girl. You're wrong. It's the complete opposite. I personally think it makes it more interesting. Life is always more fun when there's a mystery, no? Tilting her head, Haruta smiled slightly, finding herself nodding. Ignoring the fact she didn't know who this stranger was, her instincts were telling her something. That he was certainly a special someone. After all, not a lot of people were known to keep Haruta distracted for long at all, let alone from her feelings. Realization suddenly peeked in the stranger's eyes as he sighed, looking down, mumbling a bunch of muffled words under his breath. Gazing back up at the girl in front of her, he held out his hand. You'll have to excuse my terrible manners. I haven't even asked your name yet. Staring back at the eyes which gazed at her, similar to eyes she had seen before, she glanced down at the hand reaching out to her, lightly grabbing a hold of it as she slowly replied. Haruta. My name is Haruta. Shaking the slightly trembling hand gently, the stranger never lost his toothy grin, before proclaiming loudly back at the girl. Well, it is a pleasure to meet you, Haruta. As for me, you can call me Sabo. Chapter 10. Prize for tournament revealed, legendary Mara Mara Nomi fruit. What's wrong? Ace stood there, frozen to the ground, his pupils scanning the article with speed, ignoring all the sounds of the street behind him. Oh oi! Pirate! The voice called out again, concerned at the lack of response. Rereading the of words again, he settled the newspaper by the side of him, bringing his hand up into view. Easily, he was able to conjure up fire, the flames dancing around his fingers. My devil fruit, it's a prize for a tournament being held here. He whispered quietly, keeping his voice low so passerbys didn't hear. Dispersing his flames, he threw the newspaper back on the ground as he faced the voice. That's possible? I thought two devil fruit users couldn't exist at the same time. Ace clenched his knuckles, his glare hitting the cobbled stones of the street. That's what I thought too. Only one can exist at once. So what are you gonna do? The voice's eyebrow raised, its eyes narrowing at the freckled man. Whipping his head around to face the voice, he frowned. If Buggy was telling the truth, then Luffy is on this island right now. And if he sees that, then... His voice trailed off, his teeth grinding. Taking a slight step back, the voice's words stuttered for a second, going unnoticed by Ace. And what of it? It's just a fruit. Scowling at the direction of the voice, he ignored it, starting to walk on forward, pushing through the countless crowds and toys which stuffed the small streets. Where are you going? I'm going to find Lou. He replied bluntly, his face still looking towards the narrow ends of the route. And you expect to find him where? All Ace could do was pray that Luffy hadn't seen that newspaper. He couldn't let his brother get hurt again because of him, especially not to something like this. Not only was that bad enough, but now his Maramara no Mi fruit was now being some kind of prize? In this pathetic tournament held by this country's king? Like he was going to let that happen. Vista hated this. He hated that not only was their brother's body missing from his grave, but his devil fruit was now being campaigned off as a prize for a ridiculous tournament held in a ridiculous city. And now he was stuck there, given the task of finding his fuming captain and his sister who ran off without a trace. So when he spotted the familiar blonde scruff of hair in the distance, he gave a sigh of relief, pushing through all the crowds, screaming out his captain's name despite the onlookers. Marco. Relieved that the person bearing the blonde hair turned around immediately, Vista smiled, only to be met with the same grieving face the blonde had been wearing since the island. Vista? What are you doing here? Breathing heavily, Vista stood beside his captain, looking up at him with confusion. Everyone's worried about where you had gone. You know, you really shouldn't leave us standing there like that. Even though that Marco was now his captain, the formalities seemed to rarely change from when they were before, some even refusing to accept what had happened to their previous captain. Marco stared down at his brother, his eyes still blanked and frozen. Turning towards the queue that he lined up in, he stepped further. I'm entering the tournament. Enter the tournament. Vista slowly processed, blinking a few times. Understanding his captain's objective, Vista straightened his back, sighing. Are you sure you want to do that, Captain? It's not like you're just any rookie, people will recognize you, you'll be bringing in unwanted attention. I understand that. Marco immediately shot back, taking yet another step forward, his eyes still glued to Vista. It's something that I have to do. Only now did the Phoenix's eyes leave his brother, and instantly onto another person, two people in fact. They stood there in front of him, one easily standing out as a giant, and other as an elderly man. Or so it seemed so to a blind eye. Vista stared in the same direction of his captain, raising an eyebrow as he too saw easily through their disguises. The elderly man approached the assistant on hand, followed by the giant. My name is Lou Dash. Vista instantly looked back to his captain, ignoring the giant banging the elderly man on the head harshly in the background, as his thoughts tried to catch up with him. You don't think that that's Dash? It's him all right. Marco interrupted, his eyes still staring straight at the duo, narrowing them as they parted, the older heading off into the arena. It looks like Ace's brother is here as well. Closing his eyes, Vista leaned against a pillar, his face directed towards the floor. So, what are you going to do now? You can't exactly go and beat the kid up, he's here for the same reason you are. A crash suddenly interrupted their conversation, people surrounding the area starting to scream. Vista quickly reopened his eyes, turning around to the direction of the sound, staring at the group of people which surrounded an area of the ground. One's fallen. Is he dead? You idiot. No one can survive a fall from that height. He's bleeding. Vista blinked a few times, questioning whether he should go other as well to see if the person was alright, but who was he kidding? Taking one glance at the height of the Colosseum, it was clear that nobody would survive a fall like that. Turning around to resume his talk with Marco, he was left staring at a blank space, his captain already gone. Sighing, he shook his head, slowly making his way over to where the crowd was gathering, pushing his way through to get a better look at the person. Staring at his face, Vista's world seemed to freeze. And no. It can't be. Listen to me, pirate. In the far-off distance, a looming figure in the shape of a colosseum stood, Ace's blood beginning to boil at the sight of it. Pulling his cloak further over his head, his pupils darted everywhere, scanning the area for any sign of entry to the building, his eyes lighting up when seeing a public entrance to spectators. His eyes quickly returned to a glare when the figure to the voice popped up in front of him, mirroring the same glare he had. "Don't go in there." "What?" he exclaimed, gliding straight through the figure and back towards the entrance. Appearing once again before Ace, the voice held its hand up in front of him. "I'm telling you, it's a bad idea. Don't go in there." His eyebrow twitched, walking again through the voice. "If there is a possibility that Luffy is in that building, then I am going in. Simple as that. So if you're going to continue to stalk me, do so with your mouth shut." Seeming to do the trick, the voice went silent, following Ace as he went through the guards and onto the steps of the arena, barely getting a space to stand on the top row. "Damn, this place is crowded. It seems like a lot of people want to witness the fight for that fruit." Twitching, Ace leaned against the top window, muttering countless things under his breath. "It shouldn't even be here in the first place. You died. Once a devil fruit user dies, isn't it ordinary for their fruit to grow once more?" Twitch. "But I'm not dead anymore. And I can use my devil fruit, so it shouldn't even exist." "Humph." The voice mumbled for a second, staring directly at the approaching duo of ladies, dragging along a hidden glass case, along with a ridiculous-looking gladiator. Speaking into a transponder snail, everyone around deemed to be quiet, listening with glee at the words he spoke. "Today we come with a rare and shocking item, one that the king has deemed suitable for such a prize. There was a man who lost his life in the Marineford War 2 years ago, the Pirate King's son." Ace twitched, trying hard to control his anger. The now legendary second commander of the Whitebeard Pirates, Ace. TCH. This is stupid. It is said his fiery fists pierced through battleships, burned cities, and changed them into hell on earth. Another mumble could be heard from the voice, causing the said commander to shoot at a death glare. That amazing ability has once again become a devil's fruit and reappeared in this world. Behold! Drawing all his attention towards the covered glass case, he inwardly shuddered, bracing himself for what he was about to see. After all, it wasn't like he was expecting to see the fruit again, that was the last thing on his mind when he first ate it. Hearing the voice speak once more, Ace glanced away from the fruit. "I can't allow you to see it." Ace raised his eyebrows, staring at the figure with wide eyes. "What? Try to forgive me for what I'm about to do." Unsure of what it meant, Ace continued to stare at it. "Do what?" As those words left his mouth, its hand reached out, took a hold of his cloak, surprising the fire user at its touch, as it easily pushed him from his spot by the top window, pushing him out onto the open air. Ace felt time freeze, the air unable to catch him as the gravity started to pull him down. Taking his last glance at the Colosseum, he saw the figure peering at him with guilt, the sounds of the fruit being revealed. The Mara Mara no Mi fruit. Air started to gush by him, immediately bellowing a loud crack noise as he hit the floor with force, feeling his consciousness fade as his fingertips were met with blood flowing from his head, unable to make the noises around him make sense. Someone's fallen. Feeling his eyelids grow heavier, he was able to make say last word before the darkness took a hold of him again. Shit. Chapter 11. Vista stared at the immobile body that lay in front of him, his stare not leaving vacant face which belonged to it. Hastily making his way through the crowd, his hands began to shake, pushing the citizens out of his way. Gasping, his throat went dry, his own body becoming inches away from his fellow dead brother. His lips started to timidly shake as he let out a shuddering breath, ignoring the countless shouts from the people behind, his own voice stuttering with an edge of fright. Ace? What did he say? I think he said ache. Wait, he's aching? You idiot. Why would he say that? Falling to his knees, crushing part of the ground below him, Vista's mouth hung still agape, his pupils trembling as his hand slowly reached out to the bleeding body. He'd be lying if he said he was breathing when, suddenly, he felt warm air breathing off Ace's skin, unlike the cold, icy touch the swordsman was expecting. Putting his hand in front of the freckled man's mouth, his pupils widened with shock, his instincts instantly picking the man up and gently throwing him over his shoulder. There was no way that was possible. If this man was indeed Ace, then how the hell was it possible that he was breathing? Yeah, sure, it wasn't a gasping breath which was clear to everyone that the man was living, but it was still a thin breath which escaped his lips. And that was easily enough for Vista to sling the man over his shoulder and rush back towards the ship's medical bay, ignoring all the commotion of throwing Ace's alive body on board. He didn't care about questions, he didn't care about answers. All he cared about was helping what seemed to be his brother. What he did not expect, however, was for when he was to reach the bay for the ship he was previously running to have disappeared. What? No, not now! He yelled, feeling the body on the back of him begin to move. Instinctively, he glanced back, nearly collapsing onto the floor when he saw two widened eyes mirroring his own staring back at him. Hastily running over to a shadowed spot, he dropped the man on the floor behind him, quickly turning round to face the previously collapsed body which happened to have the face of his deceased brother. Vista! What? The said man questioned, his hand flying to the back of his head as he looked down at the floor below him. Gulping, Vista tried his best to remain his composure, shaking in his spot. Ace! No way! That can't be you? Looking back up from his stare, surely enough faced Vista was the all-too-familiar looks of his brother which he had come to dearly miss, his eyes staring at him with a hint of confusion and guilt. Shaking his head, the man who looked like Ace weakly smiled. Vista, is that really you? Not giving a second more of silence, Vista rushed over to his brother's side, ignoring all the comments he would normally receive, as he flung his arms over the cloaked one's shoulders, his body still shaking. It's a miracle! Surprised, Ace yelped a little, struggling for air as the swordsman hugged him harder. Air, Vista! I need to breathe. Letting go reluctantly, Vista's eyes shook, the tears overflowing from his eyes. Sniffling, he brought a tissue close to his mustache before flinging it at the said fire thrower. How are you even alive? You died in front of all of us, there was no way you could survive a hit like that. Does this have to do with you not being in your grave? But that's impossible, someone stole you from there. Huh? Ace immediately interrupted, getting up from where he was sat. You were at my grave? When? Vista? Seemingly ignoring Ace's words, Vista continued. That can only mean one thing. Clenching his fists in front of his darkened face, Vista stayed, glued silently to the floor. Raising an eyebrow, Ace moved closer, reaching out to the now silent swordsman. What do you mean, one thing? Staring, Vista unsheathed his sword, grief-stricken on his face. I hope that somewhere, up there in the heavens, you can hear me, Ace. I won't let anyone control your body like this. You bastard! Barely dodging Vista's attack, Ace quickly leapt to the side, watching as the sword easily sliced through the wall which previously stood behind him, gulping as he met the glare that Vista was sending him. Raising his sword once more, he sent the next blazing attacks at Ace's figure, shattering every wall, building or furnishing surrounding the duo. Gulping, Ace stared at Vista with widened eyes, uttering out two words which he seemed to be using a lot more recently. Oh shit. Haruda's eyes were glued to the scarred man before her, her own lips testing out his name as she let go of his hand. Sabo? Quickly responding to her question with a bow, he tipped his hat off, rolling it into his other hand, straightening up his back as he plunked the top hat back onto his shortened hair. Yep, that's my name. He laughed, before slightly leaning forward towards the girl, his eyes examining her face. May I ask what you were crying about before? Startled by his sudden question, she snapped out of her gaze and wiped her hand over her face, slightly grumbling under her breath as she peeled her eyes away, trying to look interested in a nearby lamppost. It's nothing. Obviously her efforts didn't work, for she could still feel the stare of Sabo piercing her. Sighing, she turned to face the man once more, folding her hands over her chest. Why should I tell you? We're strangers after all. Placing a hand over his own chest, he sent her a half-hearted smile, leaning back a step. Chuckling slightly under his breath with laughter edging his tone, he retook that step forward. Ah, Haruda, that hurts. You act like this is the first time a complete stranger has approached you kindly. Is it not normal for a gentleman to ask a crying lady what is wrong? Blinking as she took a step back, Haruda's eyebrow twitched, the edges of her lips scowling. Everyone who was acquaintanced with Haruda knew very well that the term lady did not sit well with her. After all, being surrounded by a crew full of men, one does not tend to pick up ladylike habits. Do I look that upset to you? She said with a twitch of threat in her voice. Being silent for his response, he quickly pulled off his glove to wipe a tear which was still vacant from her eye, sending Haruda a gentle smile as she looked at him with widened eyes. No, not at all. Trying her hardest not to act happy with the gesture, she turned back to the ever so interesting lamppost once more, trying hard to stray the conversation away from herself. Right about then, she noticed the walking toys around her, causing her to gasp in shock. It looks like you haven't been to this island before. Slowly shaking her head, she blinked a few times, before blatantly pointing at a passing toy. Are they supposed to be doing that? Placing his hand on his chin, Sabo's eyes wandered off as he tried to place his words correctly. The locals here consider them to be as alive as anybody else, some even becoming adopted into people's lives and treated like any normal living being. Silently whispering the last part, Sabo looked away from Haruda's eyes, his own eyes glazing slightly. But what they don't realize is the darkness that behind these toys. Clearly hearing the last part, Haruda tilted her head, a questioning, escaping from her lips. What did you say? Looking back at Haruda, his eyes quickly came back to life, waving his hand to the side as he sent Haruda a grin. Just talking to myself, I tend to do that a lot. Nodding slightly, she decided to leave that comment alone, before another question floated into her mind. So I take it you live here? Slowly shaking his head, his gaze reached the passing residents. No, I'm just passing by. Passing by? She questioned once again, with a sudden flick of anger crossing her face. You mean for the tournament? Bringing his finger up to his mouth again, Haruda quickly interrupted his following words with a sigh, placing her hands on her hips. Let me guess, it's a secret? Dropping his hand down from his mouth, he sent Haruda a smirk, a chuckle silently passing his lips. Mysteries are way more fun, aren't they? Twitching once more, she turned her back to him. Letting out a soft voice, so that only Sabo could hear, she bit her lip, her glazed eyes hitting the pavement below her. Someone who was like family to me died a few years ago. I thought that maybe there was a chance he was still alive, but I just found out that was impossible. Silently listening to the girl, Sabo's gaze softened, his own eyes wandering up to the sky above. Clenching her fists, she shook her head. Trying to keep the desperate tears which were begging to fall down her face in once more, Haruta lowered her head. He didn't deserve to die. Not like that. I wish I could see him again, just one more time. Raising her voice at the last words of her sentence, she timidly jumped at the touch of another on her shoulder, turning round to face Sabo with moist eyes. Sending her another one of his gentle smiles, he rashly took a hold of her hand as he dragged her through the crowd, stopping in what seemed like the center of the town, a loud vibration of music hitting her ears. Her eyes widened at the sight of toy marching soldiers which passed both her and Sabo, followed by countless human-sized plush toys which were dancing swiftly along to the music. Crowds gathered around to share the sight, glee easily passing through everyone's faces. Looking up to Sabo next to her, her eyes narrowed slightly when she saw the pained look he wore, as he too stared at the parade passing through. Noticing her stare, he turned to look down at her with a grin, clapping his two hands together. I'm starving. Sabo's grin grew, his eyes lighting up. How about we get a bite to eat? Staring at all the other contestants surrounding him on the balcony which he was now hanging off, Luffy looked each person up and down, trying his hardest to quickly judge each person on their strength. After training with Rayleigh for 2 years, he'd gained plenty of new strategies and moves, so much so that the rubber team couldn't wait to jump into the fight. Whistling happily, Luffy swung over to the next balcony, jumping over the side and laying his head on the rail. He was pretty sure that Rebecca? Was that her name? She was nice, he liked her. She'd given him food, though she said his fight wouldn't be for another hour. His stomach grumbling at the thought of food, Luffy groaned, a bored look edging his face. It had felt like he'd been waiting forever, and it didn't help that Garp. Luffy shivered inwardly. Simply the name giving him flashbacks of the Fist of Love had pissed off the other contestants, which led them to hunting the teen down. Though he didn't care, he just wanted to fight. Come on. The teen whined, his arms drooping over the side of the balcony. He wondered how his crew was doing, hoping that they didn't mind his sudden absence. Law wouldn't be mad, right? Nope. Not a chance. So it really is you, Straw Hat? Startling him from his thoughts, Luffy turned, his sight met with a shadowed figure approaching him. Huh? The man was lanky-looking, wearing a scruffy blue and white striped unbuttoned shirt along with dark blue demon shorts. Though that wasn't the thing that caught Luffy's attention, that being the blonde hair sitting on his head. Luffy turned round completely to face the man, searching his mind as he tried to remember where he had seen the man before, though obviously failing due to the shaking of his finger which was now pressed against his head. The man closed his eyes, letting out a quiet yet sinister declaration. I know you're here for similar reasons, but I'm going to get that fruit. Even if it's the last thing I do. Licking his lips, the teen ignored the man's words, searching his mind for any clue to who the man was. Why is his hair making me so hungry? He mumbled. The man continued on, his eyebrow twitching at the teen's response. I would recommend that you leave the fighting up to me, Monkey D. Luffy. It would go against what I believe in if I were to hurt his younger brother. Clicking his fingers, the teen yelled, throwing his arms in the air. That's it. Blinking, the blonde tilted his head quizzically. What's it? Your hair. The rubber teen responded, his mouth stretching out into a grin. It looks like a pineapple. Letting out a bellowing laugh, Luffy leaned on his knees, unable to control the laughter. Staying silent, the blonde only stared at the teen, his mouth slightly agape. Breathing heavily, Luffy wiped his tears, straightening his back as he grinned towards the man. You're Marco, right? I heard that you saved me back at Marineford. Dusting off his armor, the teen approached the silent blonde, bowing suddenly. Thanks. Marco stood there, his only movement being the blinking of his eyes, as he took in what Luffy was saying. It's fine, he muttered out, gesturing for the teen to stop bowing. You're Ace's brother. There's no need for your thanks. Raising from his bow, Luffy readjusted his helmet, a grin still stuck to his face. Before the blonde had a chance to speak, the teen spoke again. I wasn't just saying thanks for that. Thank you for being there for Ace all those years. Huh? Ace seemed super happy when I saw him in Alabasta. He seemed like he really cared about you guys. I mean, Luffy pouted, crossing his arms childishly. I was shocked that he'd joined a crew, after I invited him to join mine all those times, so you must have meant a lot to him. So thank you. Silence. Hey? You okay? Walking over to the blonde, the teen waved his hand in his face, concerned at the lack of response. You look kinda ill. Suddenly shaking his head, Marco moved back, his eyes shadowed over. I'm fine, it was nothing. He mumbled out, his eyes not wanting to meet the teen's. Stepping back, Luffy nodded. Are you here for Ace's fruit? He questioned, surprising the older man. The look of shock seemed to be enough for the teen, as a chuckle left his lips. Well, I am too. And just like you, I'm getting it no matter what. But dash. Interrupting Marco, Luffy grabbed the rail. No buts. You can't go deciding things like that for me. If I'm gonna have to fight you, glacing at the blonde, the teen prepared to jump, a mad smile on his face. Then I'm gonna have to fight you. Not waiting to hear the man's response, Luffy leapt over the edge, ignoring the several screams and yelps that came from fellow contestants. Stretching out his arm, he reached for the opposite balcony, landing smoothly with a laugh. March. Wait. What was his name again? Pineapple? Yes, Pineapple seemed like a nice guy. Broody, but nice. This is going to be interesting. He yelled to no one in particular, startling the people around him. After all, he did have a few tricks up his sleeve. Marco watched as the teen flew from the railing, shouts of terror and surprise resonating through the balconies in the distance. Letting out the breath he'd be keeping in, he swept his face, wearily going over the exchange he'd just had in his mind. The familiar feeling that crept over him was slowly going away, leaving the blonde to do something he hadn't done in years. He found himself smiling. You really are brothers, aren't you? He questioned aloud, his voice amused. Looking down into the Colosseum, his smile wavered, his thoughts focusing on the fight that was now inevitable. I look forward to fighting you, Luffy. Chapter 12. Fate must really despise Ace. Bad luck stalked the man, similar to the way animals stalk their prey before killing them off. Why was Ace thinking this though? He wasn't a lucky man. After all, the word luck isn't a word many people would say to explain a situation such as being thrown off the roof of a Colosseum by an imaginary voice in your head. Not only that, but now he was waking up to a sweaty, obviously panicking man carrying him on his back. Not the way Ace had expected or preferred to have been woken up to. That is, he wasn't expecting to wake up at all. Before he had time to frantically check the should-be wounds on the back of his head, the running figure halted in his tracks, clearly searching for something in the ocean. In front of them, a slight sigh escaping his lips as he search failed. Thinking this was the best time to escape, Ace slowly leaned back, doing his best not to alert the carrier of his aching body that he was awake, before the said carrier turned his face round to face Ace. Ace had to blink multiple times to make sure what he was seeing wasn't an illusion, his pupils widening within seconds. Vistash? Suddenly a gush of wind blew his words away as the Vista lookalike suddenly ran into a deserted corner, throwing Ace off the carrier's back and onto the floor harshly, causing his aching pains to peak again, his mouth scowling. Vista! What? Seeing that he was again back on solid ground, Ace immediately reached up to check the wounds on his head, preparing for the pain to soar down his neck. Instead, he raised his eyebrows, gripping the back of his head harder to make sure what he was feeling wasn't his head becoming numb. That wasn't right. It had felt fine, perhaps even better than it did before he had fallen. Turning his hand into his fist, clenching his fingers, Ace's eyes glazed over in thought. That's impossible though. Wasn't there blood pouring from my heat? Ace, no way. That can't be you? Words suddenly broke Ace from his thought, the said ex-commander peering his eyes up to the stuttering man before him, guilt passing through him as he saw the pained look of his old friend's eyes. Deciding it would be best to fill the silence, Ace shook his head, weakly smiling as he stuttered out his words. Vista, is that really you? Immediately as those words were said, Vista rushed over to Ace, throwing his arms around the freckled ones as his body began to shake. It's a miracle. Surprised, Ace screamed a little, unable to breathe due to the swordsman grip around his body. Air Vista. I need to breathe. The guilt hardly faltering with those words, Ace furrowed his eyebrows, inwardly agreeing with the mustached man's statement. Bringing a tissue to his face, Vista cleared up his eyes, before throwing the said tissue at Ace's face. How are you even alive? You died in front of all of us, there was no way you could survive a hit like that. Does this have to do with you not being in your grave? But that's impossible, someone stole you from there. Flinging the sodden tissue away, Ace turned to Vista with widened eyes, getting up from where he was sat. You were at my grave? When? Vista went silent, his arms beginning to shake. Vista? Ace questioned again. Seeming to ignore the freckled man's question, Vista eyes shadowed, his thoughts obviously plaguing the conversation they were having. That can mean only one thing. Confused, Ace moved closer, reaching out to the now silent swordsman. What do you mean, one thing? Finally moving from the spot he was glued to, he slowly unsheathed his sword, picking up the pace of his feet as he shouted towards Ace. I hope that somewhere, up there in the heavens, you can hear me, Ace. I won't let anyone control your body like this. You bastard dash. Ace blankly stared at him, repeating in his head what his companion just said. What? Barely moving inches away from Vista's attack and out of his thoughts, Ace quickly leapt to the side, gulping as he stared at the wall behind him sliced in half, then inwardly shitting himself as he peered over to receive the furious glare which Vista was throwing him. His mouth suddenly becoming dry, Ace stared with his pupils enlarged, barely uttering out two extremely accustomed words from his mouth. Oh shit. Swinging his sword once more, Vista blatantly ignored all the signs of civilization, crushing the houses and stalls around him, causing for people surrounding the area including Ace to scream and run to safer places. Why you scum! You'll die for what you've done. Peering his head around his shoulder, Ace ran rapidly down the center of the street, grinding his teeth as he came to a halt, deciding and trying to calm down his fired-up brother. Vista, shit! Another attack pinpointed towards Ace, the ground shattering in front of him as he ducked once more into another shadowed street. You have to calm down. I know it seems completely impossible but it's really m-dash. Still though, Vista ran towards Ace, ignoring all attempts at conversation as the swung the sword at Ace's neck, wind gushing behind him as his sight was filled with a street without his target. Turning around in the opposite direction, he spotted the man rushing into a house, flinging the door behind him shut. Kicking open the door without struggle, Vista sprinted up the stairs, slightly growling at the returned sight of his half-dead brother standing by an open window. Seeing the place as a dead end, Ace gulped, turning around to face the unpleasant sight of his enraged brother, bringing up his hands once more as he took a step back. Vista. It's me. Ace. Your brother. Looking to see no recognition of accepting that fact on Vista's face, the fire-thrower twitched, clenching his fingers into a fist as he continued to shout back at his brother. I have proof. Ace began to awkwardly laugh, bringing his hand behind his head as sent the man a half-hearted smile. Do you remember that time when your top hat went mysteriously missing and turned up in your cabin with it dyed pink and fake bunny ears attached to it? Well, It was me. Isn't that funny? There's no way that anyone else knows about that incident, so how about you stop attacking me now? Vista continued to stare dangerously at Ace, causing the said fire thrower to inwardly sweat drop. Okay. So maybe that didn't help the situation. Not only do you steal his appearance, finally muttering out words, Ace brought all his attention to his brother, eyes narrowing at the threatening tone he was using. But to steal his memories as well. Vista started to shake once more, bringing his sword closer to the fire user, holding it horizontally towards him. You will never be forgiven. Twitching, Ace brought up his fist hesitantly, not wanting to fight back against his brother. I already told you, Vista, it's not like yelling interrupted his words, as the floor below him suddenly shattered from another one of Vista's sudden attacks, causing him to jump back, completely forgetting about the open window behind him. Shit. Falling from the window with shock, Ace crashed down onto a building below, easily breaking through the ceiling and down into a hole, which was placed in the building itself, before crashing into someone below. Haruta stared at Sabo with narrowed eyes, her senses peaking every time a sound was echoed around her. Easily noticing the commander's uneasiness, Sabo raised an eyebrow, ushering the waitress dressed in clothes representing a bumblebee to another table. Is there something that's bothering you? He asked bluntly, causing the said commander to twitch and send her gaze somewhere else. How can you not recognize it? Haruta's sight peered over to the place where everyone in the restaurant was staring at, their faces mortified with shock. Smirking as he too glanced over to the sight, he laughed, flinging his hand up in the air with his finger straightened. Have you never seen a hole before? Twitching again, Haruta turned to face the smirking man, grumbling under her breath. Of course I have. Placing her elbow on the table, she held her chin in her palm. Just not in a place like this. Don't act like it's not weird. Bringing his hand down, Sabo nodded, keeping silent as he brought the cup placed in front of him to his mouth, slowly sipping its contents and placing it back down. I admit, I am curious on how such a hole got there in the first place, but you've got to stop staring at it like that. Your face might stay that way. Jolting from her spot, she inwardly hissed at the man, grumbling more under her breath as she saw him smirk once more. Yeah. Bringing her other hand up, she waved it in the air, trying best to steer the conversation. Anyway, I've been wanting to ask you this the whole time, but why have you brought me here? Tilting his head at such a question, Sabo blinked, sending a grin at Haruta. For something to eat. Eyes slightly widening from the idiocy of the blonde, she slipped her chin from her palm, banging her head harshly on the table, a tch, followed by a sigh passing her lips as she held her head. I know that. But why do you want something to eat, and don't you dare say because you were hungry? A chuckle suddenly split from the blonde's mouth, causing Haruta to raise an eyebrow. Why, do you have a problem with the food? I hear they serve fantastic lemon soufflés here. He said, his stomach grumbling loudly. Haruta continued to stare at the man with a displeased look, making Sabo smile. Bringing his hands up in the air, he tilted his head, sending Haruta a small smile. Would you believe me if I said that I just wanted the good company of someone whilst I eat? Instantly grabbing the fork placed by her and throwing it towards the blonde's head, she sent him an irritated look, a threatening glaze directed at the blonde. Don't think I'm an easy pushover for your word, Sabo. Tell me honestly why you brought me here. Bringing his hand out of sight and instantly in front of his face, Sabo's smile faltered, gently placing the fork down onto the table once more, silence suddenly balancing between the two. Haruta kept her gaze at the man, not twitching once at either movements he did. Sighing, Sabo leaned forward, whispering out his words. Because Haruta, both of us have a common goal in mind. Leaning back slightly, Haruta narrowed her eyes, listening intensely to the man's words. A common goal? His smile growing wider at the other's acknowledgement, Sabo lifted up a newspaper which was placed by his side, putting it less than gently onto the table. You were a crewmate of Portgas D. Ace, correct? Twitching at the mention of his name, she sadly gazed down to the newspaper placed in front of her, biting her lip as she thought how to answer the question. What of it? Then you would agree that this whole competition for his devil fruit is repulsive and something that must be stopped, no matter what. Sabo immediately responded, his face suddenly becoming shadowed from the light. Startled by the sudden question, she continued to stare at the newspaper with widened eyes, easily noticing the emotion the man was showing before her. Swallowing her words down, she faintly nodded, her eyes becoming glazed once more as she thought of the events which had happened recently. Shaking her head out of her thoughts, she turned her look away from the newspaper and onto Sabo, curiosity edging in her voice. Why would you care about that though? The blonde remained silent, it being the first time since she met the man, slightly unnerving Haruta as she looked on. Twitching again, she banged the table harshly with her hands, ignoring how loud she was being as she startled Sabo from his thoughts. I'm guessing that you want some kind of help from me, correct? So you can at least tell me why you want to do, whatever it is you're planning to do. Staring at her with empty eyes, he smiled ever so slightly, nodding. If you want to know, he ushered silently, mirroring Horda's actions earlier by placing his chin in his palm, his eyes directed at the newspaper. The reason is purely personal. For I can't stand by and let my brother's devil fruit to be taken away as easily as that. Silence. Piecing together each word, Haruta stared at the man with huge pupils, stuttering out her words. Wait. Holding her hands in front of her, allowing for her previously threatening position disappear, she gaped at the man. Hold up a second. Did you just say dash? Nodding once more, Sabo looked up from the newspaper, forcing a smile. Ace, he's my brother. Are you feeling okay? You're not looking so good. Haruta? Barely stuttering out her words, Haruta blinked a few times, before screaming aloud, "DH," and once again banging her head onto the table. Smirking, Sabo laughed weakly at her actions, nodding his head as he sighed out his words. I don't get why so many people react like that when I tell them. Why you're nothing alike. Haruta bellowed, once again ignoring all signs of quieting down as she brought her head up from the table. You really expect me to believe a stranger I met in the middle of nowhere to be Ace's brother? Ah. Sabo pointed his finger up, causing Haruta to lean back further, but still capture her attention. You're wrong there. This isn't just the middle of nowhere now, is it? Haruta blinked, her eyes saddening at the recognition of his words, her head slowly nodding. And that is why I want you to help M dash. Purapuparuparu. Huh? Haruta jumped from her seat, alerted by the familiar noise which came from the blonde's pocket, raising an eyebrow. The blonde sighed with irritation. Well then. Sabo said with a grin, clapping both his hands together as he stood up from his seat. It is a shame to be leaving you this soon, Miss Haruta, but I must go. Blinking, Haruta just stared at the man blankly, her eyebrows twitching once more at the man's declaration. What? Putting the transponder snail on silent, he slid another object out of his pocket, placing it in front of Haruta. It seems my colleague has finally wondered where I have run off to. Staring at the item he placed onto the table, he turned his head away. Please do try your best to be at the right place and the right time, I'll be counting on you. Sending Haruta a smirk before she could question once more, he turned away towards the exit, leaving Haruta staring at the item in shock. Did he just? Her eyes shadowing, she gripped hardly on the edges below the table, flinging the table high into the air, alerting the other customers, as she bellowed towards the exit. That idiot. He seriously thinks he can just leave me here like this? Leaving the wreckage behind her, she stormed her way towards the door, fuming by the ears as she ignored all the shouts and warnings around her. Suddenly, she collided with something that was falling above, sending her and the thing into the direction of the hole and down underground. Cursing as she hit the floor with a crack, she whipped her head round to see that thing that she collided with, halting at the sight. Gasping, she stuttered, her heart undoubtedly missing a beat as she stared into the eyes of an old friend's face, tears immediately swelling up in her eyes. Ace? That's it for this part. Before you guys leave, please hit that like and subscribe button. Peace.